Thank you very much for joining us on this second day. We've come down to the really difficult question here. It's economics. A question that I often struggle with myself, but this is really where the rubber hits the road. Are all these commitments affordable? Where does it fit within the broader world economic picture that's developing currently? I think probably one of the most significant things that's come out of this Defence White Paper, and one of the pats on the back that the whole package got, was that it was a costed Defence White Paper, something that the previous one was not actually criticised for. When you have strategy plus dollars, you begin to have a fairly powerful combination. And just some of the figures that are mentioned are mind-boggling, I think, as a bystander or as an interested individual. Just the funding increase to $42.4 billion, or 2% of GDP, a significant percentage, which no doubt will come up in this discussion, by 2020 to 2021. $195 billion for new and enhanced capability to 2025-26. And the list, it's one which you've already discussed yesterday, but is highly significant in terms of the areas of capability that it covers. I was drawn back when thinking about this session to John Howard's opening remarks at the welcome reception that many of you attended. And his key point was said, well, the telling factor is whether successive governments continue to commit to such an extensive spending plan. The proof will be in the pudding in the years to come, and I'm very pleased. I think that we've got three gentlemen here who are going to help us explore that. I think one of the key issues is that with the rate of political change and turbulence that you have in Australia, it's no small matter in terms of keeping that spending plan alive. So I have, as I said, three earnest speakers here who are going to help us guide us through this and guide me through it as much as a chair. We have Mr. Saul Eslake, has been chief economist of many financial institutions, including National Mutual Funds Management, ANZ, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and after that has been program director of the Grattan Institute, and has also been a member of Howard Government's Trade Policy and Foreign Affairs Advisory Councils, and has just told me as well, has recently taken up as Vice Chancellor of the University of Tasmania. Vice Chancellor Fellow of the University of Tasmania. Mark Thomson really needs no introduction. I think he's the infamous man of ASPI who guides everyone through the defence budget and does us proud with his report every year. And Warren King, who's joined CMAX Advisory as Special Counsel. You would all know him very well from his role as Chief Executive Officer of the DMO, but also has extensive experience in defence industry and also 20 years experience in the Royal Australian Navy. So we have quite a breadth of experience and expertise here on this panel. So make sure you use and abuse that after they've given their thoughts on where we're heading. So perhaps, Saul, if I could ask you to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to pretend that I know anything about defence, but I am going to pretend that I know something about the global and Australian economies and the outlook for the budget. And in 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to try and sketch out some views on that I hope will be helpful to you. Given the breadth of the topic, I have to warn you that this presentation is going to be more like Bass Strait, that is to say broad and shallow, than the Mariana Trench, focused and deep. But nonetheless, I do hope it'll be of some interest to you. Let me begin with a couple of observations about the global economy, and I'm dividing this really into some thoughts about the advanced economies as a group and some observations about developments in China. We hear a lot these days about how growth in the advanced economies has been weaker than expected in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. It's commonly said that growth has been below trend, by which people generally mean that the growth rate of the world's major advanced economies, the OECD members, has, since the period immediately after the post-crisis recovery, been about 0.5 percentage point per annum lower than the growth rate that was attained between the recession of the early 90s and the onset of the global financial crisis. But when economists talk about trend growth, they don't really mean by comparison with history, but rather they mean the rate of growth that's consistent with the unemployment rate remaining stable. And what's therefore surprising, and in some ways a paradox, is that despite growth being in the world's major advanced economies below trends in layman's terms, it's nonetheless been accompanied by a dramatic fall in the unemployment rate across the advanced world to levels that are now not especially high by historical standards. Indeed, putting the same thing in a slightly different way, the decline in the unemployment rate over the last 3 years across the 34 members of the OECD has been greater than the decline over any other 3-year period in the last 40 years, with the exception of one period in the late 1980s. And that's a paradox, which has, I think, two alternative and not necessarily mutually exclusive explanations. One is that it could be that growth in the major advanced economies is being understated. And that makes sense because we know that a lot more growth in advanced economies these days is happening in the services sector, where it's inherently harder to measure than in goods-producing sectors. And we also know that a lot more economic activity and transactions are taking place both across international borders and over the internet, where in each case it's harder to measure and harder to tax. And often taxation is the basis for economic statistics as well as for revenue raising by government. So it could well be that economic growth in the major advanced economies is actually higher than is being reported in official statistics. But it's also possible, and not inconsistent with that observation, that the growth that rich economies are capable of generating is now going to be slower than it has been in our lived experience. And the most important reason for that assertion is simply demography. That not only are populations in rich countries growing at a slower rate than they ever have done before, but the proportion of those populations who are economically active is declining at an even faster rate, or the growth rate is, because of population ageing. It was only in 2011 that the first of the baby boomers around the world started to reach the normal statutory retirement age of 65. And that process is now accelerating. So that, as the chart there shows, the rate of growth of the working age population in advanced economies is now growing at its slowest rate since basically the end of World War II. And that is going to continue to be a defining feature of the demography and the economics of rich world countries over the next 10 to 25 years. Indeed, what I'd particularly draw to your attention is that merely since about 2010, the growth rate of the working age population in the OECD area has dropped by 0.6 of a percentage point. That is greater than the decline in the average rate of GDP growth between 2010 to 2015 and the average between 1992 and 2007. Indeed, arguably, therefore, all of the decline in the average rate of growth across the rich world economies in the last 5 years compared with the period before the onset of the financial crisis can be explained by demography. That's not to say that it is all explained by demography, but that it potentially could be. In addition to the slowdown in the growth rate of the working age population, there's also been a significant slowing across the rich world in the growth rate of productivity, which together with population growth and the proportion of the population that is economically active, in effect mathematically defines GDP growth. Productivity growth usually slows after big recessions because during big recessions firms reduce their investment in new capital equipment and technology, and because people's work-related skills tend to atrophy after periods of extended unemployment. In addition, of course, during this period we've had a significant increase in various types of regulation that have arguably sapped productivity growth, and we've had a great deal of political uncertainty that has probably also detracted from the pace of productivity enhancing innovation and investment. Put those two things together and the rate of potential growth, that is, what economies could generate if all the available resources were fully employed, is now and is expected to continue growing at its slowest rate since the end of the Second World War. And while in Australia the demographic trend is not nearly as onerous as it is in many other advanced economies, these trends are also applicable to Australia as well. That is to say that the rate of population growth, and particularly the rate of working age population growth, will halve roughly between 2010 and 2025, and the rate of productivity growth in Australia also appears to have slowed without there being any obvious reason to expect expect that it will reaccelerate over the next couple of years. In my view, despite the criticism that they've copped, the central banks of the world's major economies have done a remarkable job in getting their economies back to what has traditionally been regarded as full employment, in the face not only of all the headwinds associated with the aftermath of the financial crisis, but also in the face of the greatest fiscal tightening the rich world has seen since the first half of the 1980s. In the last 6 months, the unemployment rate in the US has been either 4.9 or 5%. It's been 3.4% now in Japan. It's 5.4% in West Germany, the lowest it's been since reunification, and it's 5% in the UK. They are full employment by the historical definitions of all of those countries. And in my view, not surprisingly, given that we're at full employment in those countries, we're now beginning to see the early signs of an uptrend in wage inflation. From a very low base, and not something to be alarmed about in the way that central banks and markets would have been in the 1970s or 80s, seeing it as a harbinger of a return to double-digit price inflation. But nonetheless, when combined with the trend in core inflation, which in most major economies is now upwards, and in the US specifically is now running at 2.3% above the Fed's target for inflation, you have to wonder why most of the conversation in financial markets and among central banks is about the continuing risk of deflation. You have to wonder why, as has been the case in recent months, central banks and financial markets have talked down the outlook for inflation and the prospects of increases in US interest rates. In my view, one of the long-term lessons to be learned from the lead-up to the financial crisis is that inappropriately low interest rates can be as dangerous in their own way as inappropriately high ones. And while that hasn't been a lesson that has been immediately applicable in any advanced economy in the last 5 years, in my view, the US is getting to the point where that lesson is starting to be relevant, and there could be, in my view, no more telling statement of confidence in the outlook for the US economy than were the Federal Reserve to begin raising interest rates more rapidly over this year and next than the financial markets are currently pricing. I think it's also increasingly evident from the last 3 months that negative interest rates, as instituted in both Europe and Japan, is not a particularly good idea and has actually had the opposite impact on the currencies of Japan in particular, but also Europe, than had been intended by those central banks when they instituted negative interest rates. Of course, what happens in China matters arguably more for Australia's immediate fortunes than what happens in the so-called rich world. And here, the well-documented news is that China's economy is slowing and that the mix of growth within China is changing to less commodity-intensive forms of economic activity, such as household consumption rather than fixed investment, and towards services rather than manufacturing and construction. And that, of course, reflects demographic and structural trends as well. Chinese workers aren't as cheap as they used to be, and going forward there won't be as many of them. But in response to a very sharp slowdown in economic activity last year, and little as yet recognised, the Chinese authorities appear to have opened the credit spigots again. Credit growth is rising, but not in the way that it has done in the most recent past. What's happening is that banks have been encouraged in China to lend directly to governments or to non-bank financial institutions who are in turn buying government and other securities rather than making traditional loans. And you can see that from the bottom left-hand chart there that shows where the growth in bank claims on other entities is rising. That has had the intended effect of boosting property-related construction investment at the beginning of the year and inducing a turnaround in property prices. And that in turn is flowing through to manufacturing activity, as shown by the sharper than expected rise in the Purchasing Managers Index in China for the first 2 months of the year. And it's also adding some substance to the rebound in iron ore prices from the low in early January that, at least initially, seemed not to have any fundamental underpinning. From an Australian perspective, so far so good, in the sense that that obviously gives us a short-term respite in relation to commodity prices. But here's the risks associated with it. China already has a very large amount of debt, depending on whose figures you look at, but the Bank for International Settlements figures that are internationally comparable put China's debt at approaching 250% of GDP. That's higher than for any Western country except for Japan, and higher than most emerging market economies, including the Asian economies that had such a terrible experience in the late 1990s. And what's happening is that the latest expansion in credit in China is being funded not by growth in deposits, as it traditionally has been, but by banks issuing securities, such as bonds. And what that in turn means is that the long applauded stability of the Chinese banking system, funded as it has largely been in the past by customer deposits, is instead becoming increasingly dependent on wholesale financing, in the same way that the European and US banks were in the lead up to the financial crisis. And while it's traditionally said by observers of the Chinese banking system that their very strong position on the liability side of their balance sheet, and with the People's Bank of China having close to 4 trillion, as they used to have, of reserves that could be used to backstop the banking system, that's no insulation against a run on the wholesale liability side of the banking system, which China is potentially putting itself in a position. What that does not mean is that there's an imminent risk of a hard landing for the Chinese banking system or Chinese economy in 2016, but it does mean that 2 or 3 years down the track, the Chinese banking system could be increasingly vulnerable to the kind of pressures that helped bring on the financial crisis in Western countries in 2008-9. Let me try to whip quickly through some observations about the Australian economy and then come to the budget. There's no country on earth, other than China itself, which derived more benefit from the rapid growth, industrialisation and urbanisation of the Chinese economy in the last 30 years than we here in Australia. China's industrialisation and urbanisation was essentially about vastly expanding the supply of manufactured goods, and in order to do that, substantially increasing the demand for commodities. As a country which imports manufactured goods and exports commodities, we were well placed to benefit from that. And we benefited from it in a way that other rich countries who are importers of commodities and exporters of manufactured goods didn't, and we benefited much more than other exporters of commodities did during that period because of our almost unique mix of the commodities that were at the heart of the China development story. Of course, that also means that as commodity prices unwind, we're experiencing more severe downdrafts from falling commodity prices than other commodity exporting nations. Our resources investment boom is over. And although resources exports will continue to grow quite strongly as more projects come on stream, those exports will be at falling prices and they will employ far fewer people than were employed during the construction phase of the boom. Nonetheless, Australia is doing better at weathering the other side of the commodities boom than countries such as Canada, New Zealand, South Africa and Brazil, all of whom were other beneficiaries, are doing. We're making the transition away from resources investment-led growth, aided by record low interest rates and an exchange rate that, for the most part, is still below its long-term average after an extended period of being well above its long-term average. And that is in turn driving a transition away from goods-producing sectors towards services sectors, both business and household services. And the key point here from an economic perspective is that these are much more labour intensive than mining investment was, so that even though overall growth has been, until the December quarter of last year, below trend, we've nonetheless seen a significant acceleration in employment, in the demand for labour, which backstops concerns that some people might otherwise have had about the integrity of the monthly labour force series, and that's meant that the unemployment rate has begun to fall sooner and from a lower peak than had been widely expected this time last year. All of that says that the transition to a new set of drivers for growth in the Australian economy is going as well as could have been expected given the constraints that policymakers have faced. And in my view, it also means that there is little justification or need for the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates any further. They would be better advised, in my view, to hold what ammunition they have back for use in circumstances that hopefully won't occur, but in which further reductions in interest rates could be really needed. So what does all this mean about the budget? Australia is experiencing its longest run of so-called underlying budget deficits since at least the 1950s. And partly as a result of that, on current forecasts, Australia's net debt to GDP ratio is now expected to exceed the peak set in the last year of the Keating government of 18% of GDP in the year 2017-18, before, as those projections show, gradually coming down. Now, many people will, of course, make the point that for all that looks bad by Australian historical standards, it's not nearly as bad as the budgetary situation facing many other rich countries and some emerging countries. That's true, but you also need to bear in mind that there aren't many other economies who have as much private sector debt concentrated in the banking system as Australia has, and one of the constraints on Australia's ability to run deficits and build up public sector debt is the belief that the government backstops the debt owed by the banking system, as other governments did during the global financial crisis, and Australia's ability to do that in any future crisis is heavily reliant on it having a much better public sector balance sheet than other countries actually do. On current projections, despite the emphasis in its rhetoric, in the government's rhetoric on the importance of spending cuts, in current projections, the bulk of the budget repair task is going to be accomplished by increases in revenue rather than by spending cuts. That is, in effect, the operation or the assumption that bracket creep will continue to raise the personal income tax burden until 2021-22, when the current projections arbitrarily assume that revenue will be capped at 23.9% of GDP. In most other countries, by contrast, and these are drawn from the IMS Fiscal Monitor, which will be updated, I think, next week. In most other countries, the budget repair task is being accomplished predominantly by reductions in expenditure as a proportion of GDP rather than by increases in revenue as a proportion of GDP. And the contrast with New Zealand, for example, is particularly striking and instructive for Australia in that respect. There are a number of difficulties that are ahead of any government which wants to make faster progress in reducing the deficit and returning to surplus. And one of those is ongoing low growth in nominal, that is the current dollar value of GDP. And that in turn reflects what's expected to be relatively slow real GDP growth, which is in turn partly a function of the demographic trends that I referred to at the beginning of this presentation that are almost as true for Australia as they are globally. The other contributor to it is relatively low inflation by historical standards. And that matters because the income tax system taxes nominal growth, not real growth, and therefore, as the right-hand chart shows, the revenue side of the budget is very closely correlated with the growth rate of nominal GDP. And it's hard to get revenue to grow as rapidly as it did in the 1980s or early 1990s, when nominal GDP growth is as slow as it's been and is likely to be. It's also clear that there are some parts of the expenditure side of the budget that are extremely difficult to rein in. The proportion of the budget that's now going in cash payments to individuals and families has risen, and partly thanks to the NDIS will continue to rise very rapidly over the forward estimates period. And of course, there's not much governments can do while they're running budget deficits that brings the interest side of the budget under control. In my view, a lot of the structural damage was done to the budget during the period when it was raining revenue in the lead up to at the fastest phase of the commodities boom prior to the onset of the financial crisis. The Parliamentary Budget Office has calculated, using a methodology that I devised when I was at ANZ in the mid-2000s, and which Kevin Rudd relied on when he put this point to John Howard in the Prime Minister's election debate in 2007. In the years leading up to 2008-9, revenue increases as a result of the commodities and properties boom gave the government $222 billion, of which $89 billion was handed back in tax cuts and $175 billion was spent. In the period since 2008-9, downward revisions to forecast of revenues have worsened the budget by $279 billion, but only $22 billion of that has been clawed back through policy decisions on the revenue side, and governments have spent a further $115 billion. In my view, until those decisions that were made in the glory days of the early 2000s are reversed, it'll be impossible to solve the budgetary problem we have. And one of the lessons of the 2014-15 budget experience would, I think, appear to be that there is no political appetite for solving the budgetary problem we have exclusively through cuts in spending. The public seems unwilling to accept it, and our politicians don't have either the intestinal fortitude or the rhetorical skills to sell expenditure reductions of that sort of scale. Which means that if we're unable to do that, Australia might need seriously to consider and discuss the proportion of the economy that it wishes to take in taxes. As this chart shows, Australia's tax take is low by rich country standards. And although you can say that our tax take doesn't include things like compulsory superannuation contributions and quasi-compulsory health insurance contributions, which in other countries are counted as taxes, and that chart doesn't really include comparisons with some other Asian countries that are in our region that have very low tax regimes. Nonetheless, those comparisons do beg the question of how we fund the expenditure, including on defence, that Australians want to have, and that question, I think, can't be resolved without making at least some considered thought to the revenue side of the budget. Unfortunately, it appears that that's not something that's going to be uppermost in the forthcoming election campaign, so it may be a question that takes as long to resolve as the Defence White Paper's forecast period. Thank you.
Saul, thank you very much. That was quite a comprehensive picture, I think, to lead us into our next two speakers. Now it's to place, if you like, the broader defence question into that picture that you've painted. So next, if I can pass the clicker to Mark. Mark, please, if you could give us your thoughts.
Okay. Saul's a tough act to follow. That was a masterful explanation of where we are economically. Fortunately, it actually sets things up beautifully for what I want to try and discuss. Now, the topic I've given myself here, who will pay for 2% of GDP, seems a very curious and mischievous thing to actually posit. But really, the reality is this. Although we've got bipartisan agreement on funding defence for the next decade, the government that will have to do it has not been elected yet, or the three governments that will have to do it haven't been elected yet. The revenues have not been raised. The opportunity costs have not yet been allocated. The fact is, if you want to spend money on defence, the money can only come from one of three places. You can raise new taxation, you can free up money from within existing revenues by cutting the level of government services, or you can borrow money. There's only three ways you can do it. And the decision has not yet been made as to where the money is coming from. So what I want to do now is go through and discuss what the options are for the government, and in fact what the difficulties are going to be for future governments to free up the money to fulfil the commitment that's been made on defence spending. The commitment was made in the closing stages of the 2013 election, and it was in a wonderful sentence that had four promises in it, two of which I've highlighted there. Within a decade, the budget surplus will be 1% of GDP and defence spending will be 2% of GDP. Well, that was the culmination of a debate that had been going on both sides of Australian politics, which up to that point was aspirational. There was an aspiration that at some point, when conditions were right, we would spend 2% of GDP on defence. Well, Tony Abbott put his hand down on the podium and said, no, this is a promise, we're going to do it. And the big question was, in the lead up to this white paper, with the change of leadership of the coalition, would that promise be kept? Would Malcolm Turnbull have the same commitment to defence spending as Tony Abbott had? Well, the answer that came down in the white paper earlier this year was an emphatic yes. The Turnbull government has remained true to Tony Abbott's promise, and they've put forward a white paper, which we've been discussing over the last few days, big visions, big plans for the Defence Force, big opportunities for defence industry, and it's backed it up as explicitly as anyone possibly could. They've provided an explicit chart there with numbers on the chart, and there's even a table within the white paper that shows you year by year how much money is going to be committed. And the interesting question is whether there's sufficient money to deliver everything in the white paper. That's a question we can follow up in question time. What I want to do now is talk about where the money's going to come from and how difficult it's going to be to find that money. First of all, I just want to put a little bit of context into the commitment that the Turnbull government came up with. And the big headline issue was that rather than deliver 2% of GDP in 2023-24, which was Tony Abbott's promise, it's actually going to be delivered 3 years earlier. Now, I think we need to see this change with some clarity. One way to interpret it would be that the Turnbull government is even more committed to defence spending than Tony Abbott was. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think what's happened is that the Defence White Paper was planned on the basis of projections of nominal GDP that were made back in 2013-2014 because they had to have some sort of planning basis to go with. And in the meantime, projections of GDP have fallen. And you can see there, I've got the projections of GDP. And that's why we've got 2% of GDP 3 years early. It's not a stronger commitment. It's an artefact of the budgeting process as it occurred. But there's another lesson in there as well, and that is that compound interest really matters. And if you lose a few years of what you hope would be trend GDP, it's a legacy that carries forward with you for a long time. Small differences in growth rates, even over 4 or 5 years, compound to make big differences in how much money you have. Here's a chart similar to the ones that Saul showed. This is the underlying cash balance at MyEFO, the mid-year budget update that was issued late last year. What you see there is on current projections, the expectation is that the Commonwealth will get back into surplus sometime in the early 2020s. But they'll only do so by a smidgen. The units there are percentages of GDP, so we're looking at getting back into surplus next decade by about 0.25% of GDP, which is way within the uncertainties that have historically have arisen in Treasury projections, and in fact the grey area there represents the uncertainties that they have. And other parts of the MyEFO show you the sensitivity on various assumptions of parameters, and there's a lot of uncertainty there. So we're just going to get back into surplus. Now, the political debate has moved on in Australia about deficits and debt. No one seems to mention it, but I think it's worth reiterating the point Saul made about a country like Australia with the sort of economy we have, with our dependence on resource exports and high private debt in the banking sector. We're not in a great position to accrue debt. If you look at what happened to the Europeans during the global financial crisis, lots of them had 20% or 30% of GDP debt, and now they have 80 or 90% of GDP debt. That's a very uncomfortable position to be in, especially if interest rates begin to rise. John Fraser, the Secretary of the Treasury, in a recent speech made the point that retiring debt is very important for Australia because it preserves our credit rating, which is our war chest. It's what we need to have available to be able to deal with an economic downturn in the future. So in a sense, retiring debt is a move that the government can make to enhance Australia's economic security. And in some sense, the theme that will come out from what I'm about to tell you is there's a tension here. There's a tension between defence spending to enhance our strategic security and retiring debt to enhance our economic security. Let's look a bit closer at things. Defence spending matters when we're talking about this issue. What we have here, the grey bar there, is the deficit and surplus year by year back at MyEFO. And what I've done is I've taken the explicit funding line, which the white paper helpfully provided over the decade for how much defence funding had changed relative to the MyEFO figures, and you can see that the white paper drives Australia back into deficit in the mid-2020s on current projections. It's probably not what they would like to see, but in the mid-2020s, sure, it's a long way away. But the lesson is that you can only spend each dollar once. If you want to increase defence spending, the money has to come from somewhere. And as I said before, there's only 3 places the money can come from. Once again, an echo of Saul's charts. What we've got here is cash receipts and cash payments, the difference between which is the underlying cash balance. And you can see there, just in those final years, that the spending begins to broach through the top. You can see there, once again, echoing what we've already been told, that most of the budget repair in this instance is occurring through an increase in revenues. What I want to do now is look at what's happening in a little bit of detail, both on the revenue side and on the spending side, and the message is going to be pretty simple, and that is that there's some optimistic assumptions underpinning this chart here, and that the risks are, in fact, more likely to drive us to deficit than to deliver us a surplus in a timely manner. First of all, here's receipts. Don't worry too much about the detail, but the bottom part there is individual taxation. And that is the area which is growing most quickly of all the areas of government receipts. Over the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years that we have visibility in the budget papers, it's going to go up by 29%. Now, some of that is productivity growth flowing through into wages and into taxes, but a lot of it is bracket creep. And bracket creep has entered the political debate. There is a growing expectation among voters that at some point in this election, people will come down and they'll say, at some point in the next term of government, we will address this bracket creep problem. So what that means is the expectations of revenue growth continuing out to the early 2020s, where it's then posited to remain at, I think, 23.9% in terms of taxation revenue, that assumption's not going to hold. Some tax breaks are going to be given. And we saw earlier this year, we saw the debate about the GST, how quickly that was extinguished. Despite some confusion as to whether it was going to be revenue neutral or not, the option of using an increase to the GST as a fill-up to increase revenues pretty much is off the agenda for the moment unless we get some renewed political leadership on the matter. So the risk is on receipts that the government is going to actually downgrade and we're going to get less receipts than we anticipated. We look at payments. 3 sets of payments account for about half of all government expenditure: social security and welfare, health and education. What I've done there is I've compared the 5-year growth in the 2016 budget with some historical trends that the Parliamentary Budget Office put together. Now, let's look at health and education to start with. What you see there is what's assumed in the budget is actually growth below what has historically occurred. Now, there's no secret what's going on here. We're talking about health funding and Gonski funding, the fight between the states and the government. The point is there's an unfunded slab of health and education spending that's got to come from somewhere. And in this forthcoming election, we'll see lots of argy-bargy about that. But make no mistake, that money has to be found either by way of increased taxation, or the cost of those services is going to have to be pushed down to individuals. They'll have to self-fund. And that will equate to a cut in government services. Health and welfare looks healthier on the surface. The rate of growth is actually higher than the historical average. But the big driver there is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. If you take the National Disability Insurance Scheme away from that, what you find is that the projected underlying growth is less than the historical trend. And that's a worry. But the other worry is the National Disability Insurance Scheme is a very worthwhile scheme. I'm proud as an Australian that we've put together a scheme like that. But let's be clear-eyed about it. It has enormous potential to blow out in cost. So once again, an area where spending pressures are pushing upwards and pressures on receipts are pushing downwards, which will exacerbate the situation. So what have we got? I think one way to think about this is there's a dollar out there and the dollar's being pulled in 3 directions. In one direction, it's being pulled to increase defence spending in order to respond to the deteriorating strategic environment to bolster our physical strategic security. In another direction, that dollar is being pulled forward towards reducing debt so that Australia is better positioned should we have the unfortunate circumstance, say in 5 or 6 years' time, if China stumbles, has a hard landing, the global economy has a downturn, and we have to bail out the banks, we have to do some Keynesian pump priming. Our ability to borrow money to do that depends upon getting our debt down. So there's a pull towards spending that dollar to enhance our economic security. The third direction is really what we saw in the 2014 budget. 2014 budget, to my mind, was some reasonable, there were some strange parts to it, but really in terms of magnitude, it was a moderate attempt to begin the process of budget repair, and the electorate wholeheartedly rejected it. The electorate is not in the mood to pay higher taxes or to suffer reduced levels of government services through their own self-funding of activities. In some circumstances, at various points in history, Australia's been fortunate to have stability in its political system and sufficiently persuasive politicians to be able to make the sort of changes that need to be made. The big example is, of course, the 1980s and early 90s, when we went through a period of reform. Those reforms were profound, but they took a lot of selling, and they occurred at a time where we had a relative amount of political stability. Here's what we've had since 2008. We've had 5 prime ministers and we've had 6 defence ministers. What that's a reflection of is volatility in the electorate. The electorate has no patience and little trust in the political elites and is willing to turn on a dime and punish them. It's not just in Australia. We're seeing it with the ascendancy of Trump and Sanders, who are challenging the mainstream Democrat and Republican parties in the United States. We're seeing it all across Europe. Politicians have less latitude to do what's right in defiance of what the electorate wants. If politicians want to remain in power, they have to be responsive to the electorate, and so far the electorate has been unpersuaded that the hard decisions have to be made. So where's the money going to come from? Well, there's lots of possibilities, and really what will occur will be a combination of the leadership that emerges in future governments and events. Events will drive what happens. If tomorrow there's a clash in the South China Sea, well, I would argue defence spending will, in the public eye, rise in priority and won't be too much of a problem. If, on the other hand, in 3 or 4 years' time, there's a problem with the banking sector in China, the global economy slows, people look at their superannuation accounts and find out they can't retire and they've got to work for another 5 years. Remember 2008, 2009? People will forget all about defence and they'll think that economic security is all that needs to be done. So events will drive things. I can't tell what events will be, so I don't know where the money is going to come from. But all other things being equal, my guess would be if we do find ourselves in a situation where the 2% is delivered, where the Defence Force grows in the way that it's presently planned to be, that the people who will be picking up the bill for that will be our kids. Because we'll roll this over into debt, and what we'll do is we'll live with a higher level of economic risk as a result and just pass the costs on to the next generation.
Thank you, Mark, for that, again, sobering introduction to what's going on in Australia, the defence budget. Warren, please.
Well, thank you, everybody. Luckily, I started life as an apprentice and not as an economist, so I'll keep the rest of the discussion quite simple. Look, I'm going to make a couple of assertions here that 2% of GDP is not an unreasonable expense for a country on defence. If you want to enjoy these other attributes of our society, then an effective defence force is a prerequisite for that. So I'm not going to argue about whether 2% is right or wrong or where we get it. If those who attended last night's dinner will, I'm sure, no doubt remember Kim Beazley's masterpiece of an address. So it's hard to follow something like that, but Interestingly to note, one of Kim's themes was that it's a federal government responsibility. It brought the Federation together, defence. It's also interesting to note, for those that are interested in engineering, that probably Australia's arguably greatest ever engineering feat, the Snowy Mountains Authority, could only be established under the Defence Act and was originally implemented under the Defence Act to make it happen. There's also some other interesting things about how life has moved on. When they started that project, for example, 1 death per tunnel mile was considered acceptable. 160 people died on that scheme. I don't think we could use that as a metric today. A couple of points I want to make. The first is about Australian defence industry. I will say that I've seen a lot of modelling done. We did it in the lead up to some of the submarine work. If Australian industry can be internationally competitive, then it can contribute to GDP. I will assert that it can be. We have previous examples. John White touched on it yesterday in the 80s. We have companies like CEA who make superior phased array radar for better than what you can, cheaper than what you can buy it for from the international market. And there's some sort of aura built up about Australian defence industry that it's a social welfare activity and not a genuine contributor to both our security and to our national economy. And I want to challenge that today, but I want to alert you to some of the risks, I think. When I say risk, by the way, I'm not a nervous Nelly. I'm just saying you need to understand these things so you address them. So the 2 questions I'm going to really ask today is do we have a plan for the future? Now, what do I mean by plan? Well, Sir Lawrence Street, who was looking after my probity, and by the way, I'm out of my probity period now. I'm free to operate. But I showed Sir Lawrence a plan one day, and he's a very learned gentleman, and he said to me in the words that Kim Beazley would probably use, "Well, this very interesting plan, Warren." It was about, this thick. But really, for a plan to be any good, it's got to be comprehensible and actionable. Now, for you simple sailors in the room, or even simple other folk, what that means is you've got to be able to understand it and you've got to be able to do it. You can be as sophisticated as you like in a plan, but if you can't understand it and if the industry or the people can't do it, then it doesn't work. The second point I make, and there's a bit of a laugh in our family, is are you prepared for what you didn't plan for? And that's equally important. My family think it's a bit hysterical because when we go out back, I carry a sat phone and a GPS and an EPIRB, and they say, but we're only going out for, 2 days. I said, I know we're only planning to go out for 2 days, but what if we go out for a month? You might have heard the number of bushwalkers that have been lost in the Blue Mountains for a week who said they only went out for a 1-hour walk. So it's very important, in my mind, it's not being nervous, it's very important to have a plan for what you didn't plan for. Okay, so what are the ingredients? I just roughly run through this. We actually have the ingredients now. By the way, the slides are for my benefit, not for yours. I'm so old I never can remember what I'm going to say next. The ingredients are there. I'm not going to really talk about it. We have a clear funding pipeline. We have recognition as an industry, Australian industry, as a fundamental input to capability. We have our global supply chain program. And we have what I've, on the public record, as saying the greatest commitment since Federation to the Australian defence industry, which is a commitment to a continual shipbuilding program. And I stand by that, absolutely. So the ingredients are there, but I liken this a little bit to enthusiasm walking into the kitchen with all the fresh vegetables and nuts and raisins and so on, and the nice clean kitchen, and everybody's ready to go. But can you make the cake? Can you make the souffle? Will it rise or will you have a disaster? By the way, I don't watch My Kitchen Rules, but it's sort of a bit along that line. A couple of points. Not all procurements are equal. I remember an ad years ago, oils are just not oils, Saul. Well, defence procurements are not just all the one, no matter what the budgetary value. No matter what the budgetary value. A proven in-service capabilities, buy more P8s, are really, they are complex, but they are really straightforward, and there is a significant proportion of our procurements that sit in that category. However, overseas developmental programs and Australian ISMOTs and Australian development programs have much higher levels of risk and planning associated with them. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 second that we shouldn't do them. In fact, strategic circumstances, particularly, say, the submarine, is inescapable. There is no submarine in the world that's conventional, that meets our needs, designed off the shelf, that we can just buy another 12 of. It doesn't exist. So sometimes as a nation we have to stand up, we have to recognise that risk, and we just simply have to execute the program. But I will make the point that not only does the Integrated Investment Program have more programs, they are more complex in the main. There are a lot of complex programs there. OPB, Future Frigates, Future Submarines, Land 400, all roughly occurring simultaneously. We'll have a high degree of Australian content. And I'm saying that for this to work, we'll have to have long-term partnerships are required, and they can't be simply supplier relationships. And I can tell you, harking back to my days in the DMO, I think I would have shot the next BD person that came in from some new company telling me that they were our new strategic partner, when actually all they were doing was selling their product. And one of my strong encouragements to those that are playing in this space now, or who intend to play in this space in the future, is think, are you really a strategic partner? Because these programs we're talking about are not 8-year programs or 10-year programs. These are 35, 50-year programs. The children that are going to serve on the last of the next generation submarine are not even born. Their parents might actually just be young kids. This is a genuine strategic relationship. Some of our partners are here already, we know that, and new partners may be introduced. I'll skip over that. There's a lot about how you build the, how you go about which partners and so on. I won't touch on that, but I will talk about our current capacity. A couple of points that I would make. The global military industrial bases are shrinking. So in the days of the FFG, say, John touched on that briefly. Our accessible markets, the UK shipbuilding business has shrunk remarkably. In America in those days when we bought our FFGs, the first few offshore, there were 3 shipyards building FFGs. And in fact, at the height of that program, one ship was delivered every 10 weeks. One ship was delivered every 10 weeks. Nobody in our accessible market is building military ships like that at the moment. And I will contend there's a separate reflection of that there is no structural reason that we can't build ships at an internationally affordable price with a continuous shipbuilding program. There is no structural reason. It is as good a program as any Western country has. It can be continuous, and by the use of modern technology, modern approaches, it can certainly be executable. So from a strategic reason, we've got to be very careful. If this the tensions that we imagine might exist in our region grow, then there isn't the capacity in the world's accessible shipbuilding industry that can simply ramp up and produce 10 ships for us and 40 for their own nation. And you've only got to go and look at what happened in the Second World War to realise how you can be caught short very quickly by not in having the industrial base to grow from. So this is a real important issue. The other couple of points I'll touch on this one, though, that I think is not brought out in the white paper, and it's this current capability cannot be allowed to atrophy. So we've got this growth in demand, we've got more projects coming into Australia, we've got industry going to have to ramp up. But something that's not being said, what we were allowed to do in the 80s, and John touched on this, was it's very similar to where we were in the 80s, and it is, but there's some big differences. There's a real and genuine growing tension in our region that didn't exist in the 80s. We were coming off the Cold War. So what we could do in those days is, between capabilities, we could allow the capability to run down while Navy or whoever transferred to the new capability. This is not an option going forward. And let me just highlight this point. Collins, instead of running down, will have to be actually at its absolute best, both in capability and availability, when the first of the new submarines is delivered. Absolutely at its best. Because not only do we have to have a capability that can deal with security in our region, but we have to go from 6 submarines to 12. So there'll be no running down. In fact, industry will have a double responsibility, delivering the new submarines and keeping the current capability, whether submarines or surface ships or whatever, at its absolute peak. And that's a demand that's, I don't think, well articulated and pulled out in the white paper, but it is going to be another demand on industry. Well, we have to be larger, and one of the things that's going to have to happen with our industry, it has to be larger and it has to be internationally competitive. Our military can't go into Iraq or anywhere in the Middle East or any area of conflict and say, oh, I want a playing field on my terms. They have to play on the international terms. Our Olympians can't go to the Olympics looking for a 2-metre handicap. We have to go and compete internationally, and we have to face this in Australia. It can be done, but I'm really a bit tired of the social welfare tone that appears in some of the conversations about our defence industry. We've got to pitch ourselves to be world best, not just average, world best. We need to grow mature teams. And what do I mean? I often hear about we don't have enough engineers and so on, and I am a great supporter of STEM, diversity, all those things, but it's not just about having smart individuals. They have to be able to work as a team. And it takes years to establish effective teams, no matter how smart the individuals. Anybody who follows Greater Western Sydney will know what I'm talking about. So forming a team takes time. You can't learn that. You have to practice it. You have to exercise it. We'll have to do things like that. I think in the past, specialised system centres have been a powerhouse for that capability. Anybody that was around the days of the Submarine Warfare System Centre in Sydney or the Combat Data System Centre in Fishwick were actually powerhouses where operators, industry, engineering all came together to run programs and provided excellent results. I'll touch on that later. And there is now, unfortunately, an urgency about growing Australia's defence industry. And I didn't put it on the slide because I didn't want to be reported on this. But there's two urgencies. The first is actual urgency. Replacement of Collins is, in military capability terms, urgent because it'll take time to get there. The other urgency is the political urgency that's developed about jobs. I think that's unfortunate. I would like to think that the political debate will turn to the creation of an efficient industry, because if that becomes the politics, then we can have jobs. But if we simply portray, and I know it's easy TV press to look at a welder and simply portray that the future submarine is about keeping a job for a welder, then we're missing a golden opportunity about creating an industry that provides security for this nation and provides economic growth and jobs. I know it's trivial, but it's an important point, I think, that needs to be started to be addressed as we move forward from this point. Politics has got us to this opportunity, but now I'd rather see the emphasis change. So where does it all come together? Naval shipbuilding. Some important points. There is no existing submarine that meets Australia's requirement. And there is no current workforce that is building submarines. Now, and that's not to say there's not people around who haven't built submarines, and I accept that ASC is maintaining and improving the maintenance of submarines, but it's an important point. There is no current workforce building submarines. And if it takes an extra 6 months to start the submarine project so we start it well, as opposed to portraying it that it's essential that we get someone welding as soon as possible, it'll be the wrong approach. We need to say we start this industry well. And for example, I don't know who will win this bid, if the company that wins the submarine bid says it'll be best to build the first submarine offshore first for risk management, transferring, we should do that. It shouldn't be overwhelmed by some argument that you must commit to building all 12 submarines in Australia for jobs. If you really care about jobs, start the program the right way, not for the political shorthandedness. Frigates are less complex. We can get working on that, but there are people working on frigates today. And unfortunately, some of the key people, surface ships working on AWD. And there is an important point here. Although it's portrayed as a welder's task in the sort of political debate, the key people working on that program are coming off it today. The engineers, the project managers, holistic supply chains, the supply chain into them are all winding back. So if you really want to talk about jobs, there is an urgency in the frigate program and the OPV program. As a point I made earlier, there is no fundamental reason, there's no structural reason why. It's not like the car industry. There is no structural reason why we can't be internationally competitive. My final point here is, I'm not going to talk about the answer to this necessarily, but the future commercial structure of ASC and its physical facilities are integral to this. That has to be addressed. We've got multiple programs, we've got ASC as a major and will continue to be a major participant in this one way or another. Who the ownership is, how it's structured, how the physical facilities are used, that has to be resolved. Well, some suggestions for the future. I think there's probably room for 2, maybe 3 systems, what I call system centres. Now, I'm not talking about academic centres, I'm not talking about theoretical centres. I'm talking about centres that actually work on these problems. Produce the code, produce the integration, do the designs. One I'd like to see is platform design and production. John touched on it yesterday. 3D sort of drawing packages. How do you design for production? The labour input to a surface ship is about 15%, 20%, but it can blow out on you. What's really important is how do you design a ship so it can be produced early so that the labour costs, etc., don't get out of hand. And you can introduce degrees of automation. I think propulsion is a big issue. Reliability, we saw that on Collins, the ability to upgrade propulsion trains, so on. I think that was another opportunity. And the one I would strongly recommend is combat system integration. I really think we had this ability once, and through the work we did in the 80s and 90s, where we actually distribute a lot of these skills into individual industries, we no longer have these centres of production excellence, centres of doing excellence. We as a nation love innovation. But we don't really get innovation in manufacturing. We don't really get innovation in production. But that's where the future must lie. The ability to understand how systems work, integrate new systems, will be fundamental to a successful programs. I suggest, by the way, just goes back to my old Navy days, that they be managed by defence, that they be powered by industry, but really importantly, that naval engineering be made part of these centres. The ability for naval engineers to get real experience on design, manufacturing, production, testing, evaluation, has been very limited since industry took over most of those roles. And I think it's critical for the development of naval engineering that they play a substantial integrated role in these centres. A lot of other things I can say, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Warren. I think you'll all agree what we've had there are 3 quite contrasting yet complementary presentations. If we start off with Saul, we started off looking at the global economic picture and forecast for what that might look like in the future. And certainly it becomes sobering when you look at the potential within OECD countries, looking at the demographic shifts and what that might actually mean, the potential lower potential productivity that demographic change also means, meaning lower potential growth, which surely is quite concerning for all of us, I think. But then also looking at the Chinese picture, an economic picture, because clearly being so dependent upon China for future growth as much as we have in the past, we will be keenly interested to see how that shift in the Chinese economy takes effect in 5-6 years' time. And I think that linked very, very well from your perspective, looking at Australia, where Mark took that up and then related that into defence economics. What does 2% of GDP actually mean? And what kinds of decisions then have to be made by politicians and bureaucrats in order to make that happen? Or not, and clearly some quite difficult decisions to be made there. And then I think Warren really tied that together nicely, looking at the practicalities of the Defence White Paper and speaking clearly with passion about Australian defence industry and it needing to be world-class to meet the challenges both of the Defence White Paper and maybe some of the areas that the Defence White Paper didn't touch. There was certainly a question that immediately entered my mind, and it was linking back to some of the presentations yesterday when we were looking at that strategic context and some of the changes that are going on. And one thing perhaps we didn't address, and maybe this is just me being an even worse harbinger of doom, I'm not sure, and perhaps it's too gloomy to think about on a Friday afternoon morning before the weekend. But what happens then if you have both economic insecurity, which seems quite plausible from the presentations that we've heard, added with a strategic context, which is also becoming increasingly negative. And I remember Ben Shrier's presentation yesterday, which certainly pointed in that direction too. What then happens to the decisions that have to be made by a government? Perhaps it's obvious to some, but I think it's an interesting question just to explore. Perhaps I could ask that of all panellists just to see if they have a perspective.
I'll have a go first.
Okay.
It's a question with a degree of graduation, and the answer changes. But if you look at the most extremist circumstance, sort of World War II mobilisation, where by construction you have an enormous strategic and economic challenge at the same time. And World War II, you alluded to, basically World War II, countries converted their civil production economy over to military production. You look at US car production as a gap, and it's World War II, because they converted their economy over. How did they fund that? Well, through a whole range of means, but one of them was they sold war bonds, and then they reneged on paying for them afterwards. So the answer is all bets are off, and the fundamental question on all issues of debt is who's going to pay, whose ox is going to get gored. And in extremis, governments do what has to be done and impose the costs as they can to get things done.
If I would make the point that I used a World War II analogy, or reference. I don't think that's happening. What I think, though, will be growing pressure. And if I don't know if I can go back. I had a concluding remark here, and one of the things that I said was, we're all very excited at the moment because we've got both sides of politics supporting where we are. But I think tensions will grow one way or another. But what's also we've got to be very conscious of is that we do not have a good understanding nationally or a good buy-in nationally about defence industry. I could never get the story across that over 15 years we ran 5% under budget on defence projects. I could never get that story out into the population. So what I would say to us is these things will happen and there will be pressures, whether it's economic, whether it's industrial, whether it's failure to deliver the first ship on plan or whatever. A lot of the work that should be done over the next 3 to 5 years ought to be building national resilience and political resilience and political and national buy-in to the importance of this industry. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. If that is not undertaken by you, I'm retired. You people, you're doing yourself a great disservice because something will emerge in the next 3 to 5 years or 6 or 7 years that will bring pressure on this, whether it's economic, whether it's pressure from threat. But if we don't build that resilience in the nation, if we don't make it heartland, then we'll be back again with it all over the shop and we won't have industrial base to build on. That's what I'm concerned about.
So
I'd answer that much the same way that Mark did, that if there's a trade-off to be made between strategic or military security and economic security, then the former will win every time, and the public will back that choice. But history suggests that wars are a form of economic stimulus. They're not obviously launched for that reason, but the Depression was solved by World War II and its mean of financing it. And you might recall that as the result of World War II was becoming clear from about 1944 onwards, there was an enormous concern among economic policy makers as to what you needed to do to make sure that the world didn't go back into the slump that had existed through the 1930s. And part of the answer to that was the way the US managed the peace, which was in effect to contribute to rebuilding the shattered economies of Western Europe and Japan. And I think part of the source of some of the economic and strategic problems that the world faces today is that the US in particular, but also the European Union, forgot the lessons of how the peace was managed in the 1940s at the end of the Cold War going into the 1990s. And in particular, if the lessons that the US learnt from the failures of the Treaty of Versailles and applied in the aftermath of World War II had been applied in dealing with the former Soviet Union in the 1990s, then Russia at least would be less of a strategic problem for the West today than it actually is.
Now, I have time just for one very brief question. John Blackson, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Warren King, you mentioned there was no existing submarines meeting Australia's requirements, and yet arguably that is the case with the Collins class submarine as we have it today. It's known as a bit of a dud sub, and yet my understanding is that over the years it has developed to be probably the world's best of its type in terms of range, in terms of capability. It's little advertised these days just how potent the current Collins is. And I'm wondering then, therefore, aren't we adding a degree of risk and potential doubling up of capabilities if, as you suggest, we are looking down the barrel of having to maintain the 6 Collins while we're introducing and operating the next generation submarine, when in fact we have a capability existing that is probably pretty much what we want with a little bit extra, perhaps with independent propulsion. Air-independent propulsion. So why are we not looking for a son of Collins? And perhaps Mark Thomson can chip in on that one too.
Thank you for that question. You just sort of inflamed my passions. I've come out of my stupor. This is one of the great, interesting... You actually highlighted my whole point. The bad welding on Collins was never done in Australia, for example. Does Australia understand that? The only bad welding that had to be run on Collins was done in Sweden. Now, I'm not criticising Sweden. I'm simply saying that there's a country with the most advanced, competitive, quality... There wouldn't be a person in this room who wouldn't recognise that Sweden is a quality engineering country. But here we were in Australia. We never created those problems. Now, Collins is a great submarine. It had a problem with the combat system in the early days. It was overly adventurous. I would say there's a good lesson learnt there. It doesn't have to be a... We went from an O-boat to the Collins class, and it wasn't so much in the propulsion and the size and the range. All those things did change. We actually went to the forefront of the combat system. We went beyond that which industry could develop. And by the way, the little lesson was we picked the system that America had rejected, just to be clear, right? Because it was not executable. There was some noise problems and there was a lot of work, but the point is it wasn't a failed project even then. We in Australia sort of live in this cargo cult that, oh, I'll just pay $1 billion and on the next ship from London or America or somewhere, the solution to my engineering problem will arrive and it'll be perfect from day one. In the real world, when you need, particularly in defence, when you need a capability that can't be offered anywhere else, you have to step up. Now, just to be clear, my reading of the capability of what we're seeking is basically a contemporary Collins updated for current circumstances. Better sensors, a bit more range, a bit more endurance, etc. We're not actually asking for this major step beyond that which we have, just simply a contemporary capability broadly equivalent to Collins. That ought to be manageable. The 3 companies that are offering us solutions are all competent companies. They're all able to do that. It's simply putting together the right plan. It is not a major step. But Collins is dated. It's very, very good. But when you want something that's going to take us to 2050, you've got to take that next step. But it's not a huge step. It's not the step, for example, that we went from the Oberons to the Collins class. It's not that step at all. And as people alluded to yesterday, the industrial base we're stepping from is much more sophisticated now than it was then. Now, there'll still be challenges, and I think we've got to be ready for them, but it's not the leap that we took then.
All I would add to that, I agree with what Warren said, is the other thing we're buying through the CEP, what we're seeking through the CEP, is a competent partner, somebody who has experience in design, somebody who can help us execute, and bring to conclusion what's going to be a challenging program. We haven't built submarines for a very long time. I think if we tried to restart Collins production, we'd be in a world of hurt. We need help. We need assistance from a competent submarine designer and builder to execute the program. And that's every bit as important as the design that we're seeking through that same process.
I'll wrap up this session with a couple of apologies. First of all, for being chair, I failed in keeping us to time. And secondly, to a couple of questions that I know are still in the audience. Please come and grab our panellists during the tea break later on in the morning, please, and ask them those questions. But I won't apologise for what I think has just been a really stimulating first session of the day, and I think sets us up nicely for everything that's about to flow through. So if I could ask all of you to thank Saul, Eslake, Mark Thomson and Warren King. Thank you very much.